Today I'm sharing an important topic with you. It's actually a little bit of sex ed, if you will, because we are going to be talking about non-hormonal methods of birth control. This is a question that I've been getting more and more lately, I think with the growing number of women using fertility awareness and becoming aware that there are issues with hormonal contraceptives, and then of course learning that there are alternatives, but recognizing, of course, that they're not really talked about a lot. And so I know when I was growing up, it was non-hormonal methods were talked about in a way that was more conducive to actually using them. It wasn't talked about in a binary type of way where it's like either you're on the pill or you're pregnant. And that meant that although it may not have been as actively encouraged, non-hormonal methods were considered to be legitimate options. And they had to be because women used them. There was quite a shift, I would say, in the last 20 years in terms of really discouraging women from using non-hormonal options and really downplaying the effectiveness or basically making it seem like they will not work under any circumstances in any type of reliable way. So in today's episode, we are going to dive into non-hormonal birth control and how they can be used with fertility awareness and also with each other in a way that actually can work and a way that can be very effective and a way that for the women who actually use non-hormonal methods, so this is like my realm, this is how they do it. So I know you'll appreciate today's episode, so let's go ahead and jump right in. All right, so I'm really excited to actually talk about non-hormonal methods of birth control and how to use them effectively. So today we will be talking about the fertility awareness method. So if you're new to the show, I'm not going to be going into a ton of detail about the fertility awareness method and how to use it correctly, but more so just talking about the method itself and essentially how it can be used with these other non-hormonal / barrier methods. So in addition to the fertility awareness method, we'll be talking about condoms, the diaphragm, the cervical cap, and withdrawal. And so just to be sure, this episode is not meant to be kind of the be all and end all for every possible non-hormonal method, but it's really about how to use non-hormonal methods effectively in conjunction with fertility awareness, because this is really the topic that is super important for my clients and for all women who use fertility awareness. It's a really important aspect of it. If you can identify with fertility awareness the window, so the short period of time in your menstrual cycle when pregnancy is possible, then it really isn't then up to you for how you're going to manage that, right? So that's what we're going to be talking about. So I thought it would actually be interesting to share some stats with you as a starting point. And I wanted to start with hormonal birth control. So I'm not going to go into the weeds and list every single different type of hormonal contraceptive and their, specific efficacy rate. But the vast majority of hormonal contraceptives with perfect use are somewhere in that 99, percent range. So like 99% and higher. But what's interesting is when you look at the typical use statistics, the average not hormonal contraceptive, so the pill, the patch, and the ring, for example, the typical use efficacy rates are closer to, say, 91.6, 87% for progesterone only pill users. So I think that's an interesting place to start with, because there is this notion out there that hormonal contraceptive is essentially the only option for women who are looking for birth control. And it's presented in a way as though it's infallible and kind of like as if it never fails. But the reality is that it is a highly effective method, of course, when used correctly. But even with hormonal methods, there is a rate, there's a failure rate. And with every method, there's a failure rate. So one of the things I've talked about on the podcast before is that if you are having sex with another human, then you should be talking about the fact that every single method does have a failure rate and talk about how you can mitigate that and or what you would do if the unexpected happened and you became pregnant. Now, with methods such as the IUDs, so the copper IUD or the hormonal IUD or the implant or the shot, the efficacy rate is higher. And of course, there's no typical use. If you have an IUD inserted, it's inserted. If you have an implant inserted, it's inserted. If you have a shot, you have the shot. So there's nothing you can do to screw it up, for lack of a better word. And so the highest efficacy in terms of hormonal methods is actually the implant, which is interesting, and followed by then the IUD and the shot. But even with the IUD, the IUDs still have a failure rate. Okay, so if you go back and listen to some of my Pill Reality series episodes, I did one with a woman who did become pregnant when she was using her IUD, of course, to the greatest shock imaginable. And the reason she became aware of it, I believe, because of the pregnancy, was actually ectopic. So the reason that I'm putting that out there, there's a couple of reasons. Reason number one is just to ground our discussion in the fact that all methods have a failure rate. So that's something that we should just say out loud and try to get our heads around. Although, of course, when you're using your hormonal method correctly, depending on the type you use and the type you choose, generally speaking, the risk may be quite small if you don't know the different factors that could affect the efficacy. For instance, certain antibiotics or certain drugs that you might take, or even if you're really sick and you're throwing up a lot and you don't realize, that it could affect the fact that the pill could be coming up, for example. So that's one thing. But the other thing is that with all methods of birth control, they fall on the scale between their degree of efficacy, user efficacy versus the method efficacy. And so when you're using something like a pill, you have to take it. So there is some degree of, user error that you could skip it or miss it or not take it at the right time, for example, and that could lessen the effectiveness of the method. Whereas something like the IUD or the implant or the shot, you just have to go in and get it, but there's nothing else for you to do. It's totally dependent on the method. And that is often why, healthcare providers have a preference for those methods, because the user can't mess it up, right? Like the method itself is what is giving you the efficacy. Now, when we're talking about something like fertility awareness is entirely user dependent. So it's the complete opposite end of the spectrum. You've pulled the goalie, so there's nothing there, and it's really up to you to identify which days are fertile and not, and then how you're going to handle that. And other barrier methods, such as condoms and the diaphragm or cervical cap, there's a combination, because you have to actually, use them when you're having sex, and then they also have to work. So there's a combination there. And similar with withdrawal, which we will talk about, even though I know that it can be controversial to even say the word. We'll get into that. But similarly, withdrawal, it's entirely user dependent, right? If your partner doesn't withdraw, you have no method. So that's just to kind of get our feet wet and start thinking about the differences between these methods. And I'll highlight in the show notes page, for this episode, a previous episode that I recorded with Dr. Miranda Naylor. I've referenced that episode so many times. It's found its way into the fifth vital sign, but it's because we actually talked about this and got into the concept of why it is that doctors are more prone to recommend hormonal methods over, say, non-hormonal methods, and that user failure option for barrier methods and things like that, knowing that the efficacy is entirely up to the user. For many, practitioners, they're trained that the best thing to do for their patients is to really eliminate that margin of error. And so you'll notice a trend to really pushing not just hormonal birth control, but the long-acting methods that you actually input in your body and are there for long periods of time. So that's just a little bit of background. So in terms of the fertility awareness method, in terms of the stats, when you look at perfect use, and that's a term that I should define because it's something that I'll be talking about a lot in this episode. So perfect use or correct use is a term that refers to, the perfect situation where you're actually using your method correctly every single time you have sex. And what's interesting is that it is possible to use your chosen method of birth control correctly every single time. So it is actually possible to use your method perfectly every single time. But that, obviously in the real world, it doesn't always work that way depending on the person. And then we have the typical use, which is what, it tends to look like. And so I think that the important thing to keep in mind is that, you are the one that gets to decide how you're going to manage your fertility. So for some, that concept of like, oh, wow, the typical use is much lower can be very discouraging because it makes it seem like I couldn't do that. But what I would say is that it really depends on your motivation. So from that, medical perspective, often why doctors are so discouraging is because they see the general public, and there's plenty of individuals who it's, non-hormonal methods that are dependent on the user. They're not necessarily for everybody. In fact, there's no method that is effective for everybody. And so with that in mind, when you're trying to decide what method is right for you, that's really the key. What method is right for you? What method is satisfactory to both you and your partner? And how is this going to work? Okay, so keep that in mind as we go through. So with fertility awareness, based on the peer-reviewed science, the perfect use efficacy is as high as about 99.4%. And that stat comes from the Frank Herman study, where the participants were trained in a very specific method of charting. And so these participants were using the method correctly. And so a 99.4% efficacy rate puts fertility awareness on par with hormonal methods. And so that means that it is possible to use this method accurately and effectively and have no unplanned pregnancies, or the chance being very slim. But typical use, with the typical use statistics, you have a variety of different ways that this is calculated. So ideally, you would have a one specific method of fertility awareness that people are following, and you would look at how it works out typically versus the perfect use in the study. But we often have data that is lumped in. So you might have women who've been trained in a specific method of charting, combined with women who use an app, combined with women who say they, track their periods. And so obviously that efficacy might be a bit misleading. But with that said, the typical use ranges as low as about 79.6%, again, depending on the study that you're looking at, and as high as 96.2%. So with fertility awareness, like I said, it's entirely user dependent. And so it's really going to be as effective as you are. So the key to being successful with fertility awareness and using the method perfectly is really taking the time to learn it. So I'll quickly go through, I could talk about this for like 6 hours. So I'll quickly go through and give you kind of like the overview rundown of what to do if you want to be successful using fertility awareness for birth control. So the first thing you want to do is make sure that you take the appropriate time to learn the method. And there is no one fertility awareness method. There are fertility awareness-based methods. So there's like an umbrella of fertility awareness-based methods, and there's multiple methods underneath that umbrella. And so there's some methods that are, mucus only tracking. There's methods that are symptothermal, so mucus, basal body temperature, and cervical position. There are methods that are temperature only. There are apps that use algorithms. There are the Marquette method that uses the Clear Blue fertility monitor. So there's a lot of different ways to do this. So step one would be deciding what method is appropriate for you after, doing some research, reading some books, taking the time to really understand the method itself. So the method is based on what's happening in your body. So you have to understand, how the cycle works, what part of the cycle is fertile, what part of the cycle is not, and why. And then you have to start charting. So, when I'm talking about this with my clients, I divide it into phases. So phase one, the learning phase, is the phase where you are learning, not having unprotected sex. Because before you can move on to having unprotected sex, you have to learn first. Learning means a combination of reading and understanding the underlying biological basis for the method. And then it also means charting. And so you need to take the appropriate time to learn how to chart so that you are confident in understanding your cervical fluid observations, basal body temperature, and cervical position if you're using the symptothermal method. And even if you're using like an app or something else, I would strongly encourage you to learn the biological basis and understand how to track those signs in conjunction with whatever app device that you're using. So that's step one. And if you're learning on your own, I recommend a minimum of 3 to 6 fully charted cycles. So you are charting, you are relying on something else. You're not relying on this method, and you're allowing yourself the opportunity to really understand how your cycle works. You're comfortable with identifying your main fertile signs. You're comfortable with confirming ovulation. You know the rules, and you know exactly how everything works. All right. So that's step one. Step one, phase one, whatever. So phase two would be when you actually are comfortable, confident, you have your minimum 3 to 6 cycles charted. If you're charting on your own, if you're working with an instructor, a minimum of 1 fully charted cycle. And then once you feel comfortable, you move on to phase two, which is sex in the post-ovulatory phase only. And so before you can really move on to the full cycle, you really want to understand how the cycle works, and you want to ease into it because the pre-ovulatory phase is the only part of the cycle where pregnancy can happen. So before you can have unprotected sex in the pre-ovulatory phase, you really need to understand how your cycle works. You need to understand mucus. You need to understand the rules, and basically you need to be able to identify which days are fertile versus which days are not fertile, and how to really accurately identify that window of fertility. So that is, in a nutshell, the phase 1, 2, and 3. So phase 3 would be after you've actually gone through all the steps, you've taken the appropriate time. I certainly do recommend, working with someone, even if it's a few sessions, but every woman I've never worked with a woman who didn't have questions as she was charting in the initial phases and even down the line. So I've seen many clients at the beginning of their journey when they're first learning, and they come back to me several months later for a session or to jump into one of my kind of alumni graduate programs just for a couple of months here and there to check in, because this is a process. It's like learning to drive a car. It's not something that you just read once and you're good to go. I'm not trying to say that it's so hard, but I'm just trying to say that in today's landscape with many of my clients coming off of birth control and many of my clients having other challenges, it can be very helpful so that you can feel confident to have that extra support. Okay, but plenty of women do, learn fertility awareness. I wouldn't say on their own. What I would say is the women who have not necessarily gone to instructors tend to find groups of women, whether it's online or in person, who are also charting, and they kind of share information and learn that way. Okay, so that is in a nutshell, how to use fertility awareness perfectly. It's really taking the time to learn and understand so that you can be clear on which days of your cycle are fertile and which days are not. And then when it comes to how to manage your fertility on those days, so then you have to decide what's going to work for you and your partner. So some people will opt to abstain entirely from sex or sexual contact during their fertile window. Some will opt for alternative sex, meaning no penis and vagina contact. And so you're just doing other sexual activities during those fertile days. And by ensuring there's no contact, then that is your chosen method of birth control, or specific contact, I should say. Another option, of course, is to use barrier methods, like what we'll be talking about momentarily: condoms, cervical cap, diaphragm, and or withdrawal. And so that kind of sums up then the fertility awareness method and how you manage it. So you're really identifying the periods of time when you can get pregnant, because from a scientific standpoint, there are only 6 days in your cycle when pregnancy is possible. That's because as you approach ovulation, you produce cervical fluid that can keep sperm alive for up to 5 days. So during the 5 days before ovulation, plus the day of ovulation, if you have unprotected sex, pregnancy is possible. Of course, to use fertility awareness as a method, you have to learn the rules so that you are putting in a buffer period after that to confirm ovulation. And there's a lot of different scenarios that can pop up. So you just want to make sure you understand how to manage those different situations. So the pros of fertility awareness. So I'm not necessarily going to go through all the possible pros and cons. So I'm sure you could think of others. I'm just going to go through the ones that came to mind. But the pros of using fertility awareness method or fertility awareness based methods is that it's a non-hormonal method. So it's not disrupting your natural hormones. It's allowing you to cycle naturally to preserve your fertility naturally. Normal cycling is essential for optimal health for women of reproductive age. And so this really allows you for your body to just continue to be in rhythm and flow. It preserves the health of your breasts, heart health, bone health, and there's so many other just general benefits for cycling naturally. And in addition to that, if you did have any cycle irregularities or issues or underlying health issues that were interfering with your cycle, not being on hormones allows you the opportunity to see those issues and to correct them if you happen to notice them when you're charting. So I also listed there, because I'm so generally, overall health monitoring. And one of the other benefits of fertility awareness is that if you are not using hormonal methods, so I've worked with many women who don't use hormonal methods and haven't ever used hormonal methods and were using, say, condoms or other methods throughout their sexual, history. And when you use fertility awareness and start to understand your cycle, from my perspective, you can use fertility awareness to improve the effectiveness of your other non-hormonal methods. I mean, if you can identify the specific parts of your cycle where pregnancy is possible, then that gives you the opportunity to be very, very strict with your, non-hormonal method, barrier method of choice during that time, because you know exactly when that method could fail. Other, pros that come to mind are that it fosters communication with your partner, because you can't really use this method without having conversations with your partner, without having your partner on board. So many, couples who use fertility awareness find that they are talking a lot more and really just exploring certain conversations that wouldn't necessarily happen if they were using hormonal methods, for example. So I'm sure there's tons of other benefits, but I'm going to move on to the cons. So the con, again, it really depends on the personality, because you may not see it as a con, and but I'll just kind of go through. So one of the potential cons for fertility awareness is that it is entirely user dependent. So it does require a degree of commitment, because you need to understand what's going on. You need to know what you're doing, and you basically have to take responsibility for all of it, because there's no goalie. You have pulled the goalie, so you're the goalie, and you have to be the one to know what you're doing. So it does require that you take the time to learn it. It does require that you take the time to chart and to understand your cycles. And, for many women, it does take several months of charting and learning before you actually start to feel really comfortable and confident. Now, again, for many women, that's not a con. For many women, it's actually this fantastic process that's really exciting as they're learning. But, just to put that out there, for some women, it's like, okay, that's too much, or at this point in my life, that's not going to work for me. So that's why it's there. It does require the cooperation of your partner. So if you have a super uncooperative partner who's not willing to play ball at all, then this wouldn't necessarily be the method for you, because it does require that there are periods of the cycle where you can't have unprotected sex, period, if you're trying to avoid pregnancy. So you do have to have the cooperation of your partner. And so those would be, I'm sure that other cons could possibly rise up, but those are kind of the main ones that I would say, that it really does depend on the person. But one thing I always say about fertility awareness is that no one's forcing anyone to use it. So fertility awareness, as much as it's a user-dependent method, it's also a method that women self-select. The women who choose to use fertility awareness are fully choosing it, even though society tells them that they're crazy and that it's not going to work, and all of those myths about fertility awareness. And so for a woman who, if you're listening to this and it really calls to you, and you really feel that this is the method for you, and you're willing to take the time because you're super excited to learn about your body and you're thrilled to take some time learning to chart, then absolutely it's for you. So I feel like the fact that it's a method that women self-select to, it kind of overcomes some of that. And I also feel that the discouragement that women often feel related to charting, I recently just posted on Instagram a question box, and I had so many responses. And the question was, have you ever talked to your doctor about fertility awareness? And if so, what did your doctor say? And it was really incredible to see how many women have been laughed at or told that it's not going to work, or just get on the prenatal, you'll be pregnant in a year, come back to me, when you're pregnant, like all of these kind of really condescending things. And so women who choose to chart their cycles and go ahead and use fertility awareness. These are the ones who are choosing that because it's right for them. And I feel like what's really missing in that conversation with the professionals is that motivated women who want to do this can do it. We can do it, and we can do it effectively. Of course, it means that we have to take the time to learn. In my perfect world, I would rather see, instead of doctors really discouraging women, to have a legitimate conversation about it. So I would say this to anybody: fertility awareness is not necessarily for everybody. It's a method that women self-select to if they feel really called to it. And it's certainly possible to use it effectively, provided that you take the time to learn. And if it coming from a doctor, I would recommend you consider working with a fertility awareness practitioner who's certified, so that you can really be set on the right track. I feel like that would be a more appropriate response, a more empowering response. And that really just acknowledges that for an adult woman who chooses to do this, she is more than capable to doing it, provided that that is what she wants to do. All right, off the soapbox. So now that we've established kind of fertility awareness, let's move on to some of the other non-hormonal methods. Okay, so condoms. Now, one of the things I've said about condoms quite a bit is that when I was growing up, it was the tail end of the 90s. So I grew up in the 80s and 90s. And this was really the era when the media wouldn't stop talking about HIV. So this was a time when condoms were really, really pushed and talked about quite a bit. So when I was growing up, condoms were taught to us to be an effective method of birth control. Condoms still remain basically the only method of birth control that also protects against STIs. And it's effective. So condoms are up to 98% effective with perfect use. And typical use brings them down to around 87%. So the thing about condoms is that perfect use is not complicated. Perfect use is actually quite simple to figure out. So this is why I would say that I wouldn't be discouraged by the typical use statistic. Sometimes, especially in this time, this interesting period of time that we find ourselves in, I find that condom use, or in general, non-hormonal birth control use, is heavily discouraged. And I'm definitely going to come out and say that I feel that this is heavily influenced by the pharmaceutical industry. There's just so much money in hormonal contraceptives, and it really feels like this push that has come in the last 20 years that is coming so apparent to me, especially when I'm working with clients who are younger than me, whether it's like 10 years younger than me, or 15 years younger than me, or even 5 years younger than me, basically women who came up after me. It really feels like the landscape has changed. And whereas when I was growing up, condoms were, described as effective and talked about as a legitimate, alternative birth control option, these days it just feels like it's heavily discouraged. So I just want to say that because I really do see a difference. I mean, it makes me feel a little bit old, but for what it's worth, in a generation, you can't have a birth control method all of a sudden not be effective anymore when it was effective for a really long time. So with that said, as I mentioned, perfect use is not difficult, but there's certain basic pieces of the education that are definitely missing. Okay, so in order to use condoms correctly, you start, first of all, by making sure that you are using the right size condom. So just like men wear different size shoes, they're going to need different size condoms, right? If every man's penis isn't the same size, essentially, is what I'm saying here. So there are companies, so many more than when I was really young, but there's so many companies now. You can even measure, his penis. He can measure his own penis, but length, girth, whatever, and get the appropriate size so that there's a lesser chance of it slipping off or being too tight or uncomfortable or those types of things. So that's step one. Step two is making sure that the condom hasn't expired. If the condom has expired, or if it's like in your purse or your wallet for years, then there's a higher potential that it wouldn't work. So you want to make sure that it is not expired. So you open the condom carefully, making sure not to wreck it. When you're, putting the condom over his penis, you would pinch the tip of the condom and roll it down. You pinch the tip first so that there's enough space, at the tip of the condom for the ejaculate so that it doesn't burst. And of course, in a perfect use scenario, he would be putting on the condom before there's any contact. And I'm saying that for a reason, because everyone uses protection in different ways. But if we're talking about perfect use, you would put it on before there's any contact at all. So that's important. But I would say the most important thing to know with condoms is that you want to use them with water-based or silicone-based lubricant, because oil-based lubricant, it doesn't matter if it's like Crisco, Vaseline, or, expeller pressed coconut oil, oil disintegrates condoms, whether it's latex or lambskin. You don't want to use that. And I'm sure, because I know that at least half of you who are listening right now didn't know that. And to me, that just blows my mind. It makes me wonder, like, now sex education is so bad that we're not even teaching people how to use condoms correctly. Every time I do a class, every time I've done a talk and I bring this up, it's literally like half of the women who I'm speaking to didn't know that. And many of them are like adults who've been having sex for, long periods of time. And many of my clients will be like, wow, I've been getting away with it for a while. And see, that's what happens. So if this is news to you, YouTube it, look it up, because there's plenty of videos on YouTube where a person might put a condom over their hand or something and, apply the oil. Oil literally eats the condom, like it degrades it, and eventually the condom will snap. So if you didn't know before, now you know. So that is perfect use with condoms. So let's talk about the pros and cons of condoms. So pros, non-hormonal. It does allow participation of the male partner. So I put this in the pro category because, in a world where birth control is primarily considered to be a woman's problem, I think it's really helpful and useful to have opportunities for men to participate, because plenty of men are fantastic and wonderful. I really haven't worked with clients whose partners are completely unsupportive, and working with women in this setting has really made me celebrate men so much more, because, men, they love their partners and they want their partners to be happy and enjoy sex and all these things. And so overall, my experience, at least on my end, has been that men are quite supportive for the most part. Of course, there are always exceptions. But yeah, so it allows the participation of the male partner. You would only be using it during sex. So unlike hormonal methods where you are constantly kind of taking something that's suppressing your fertility, you're only using it at the time. And of course, they're also effective in preventing STI transmission. And so condoms can, of course, be used alongside fertility awareness. And the only caveat I would say, which is what I say to all my clients, is that if you use fertility awareness to identify your fertile window, and then in your fertile window you use a condom, then you are relying on the efficacy of the condom when you have sex during your fertile window. So technically, if you want to be like super technical with the wording, if you are actually having protected sex during your fertile days, you are using the method. So you're using a condom. So just if that makes sense to you, you're relying solely on the efficacy of the method that you choose. And of course, this is why a certain percentage of women who use fertility awareness will opt to abstain entirely during their fertile window. But of course, the great thing about this method and this conversation is that you get to choose what's going to work best for you and your partner. So some of the cons about condoms. So you do have to remember to use it every time. It is something that you have to put on. And, for many, it would involve disrupting that, natural kind of mood. It does reduce the sensation or changes the sensation. So, some couples are totally fine with condoms and love condoms and use them all the time. And other couples don't love the feeling of it and really would prefer not to use them. So that's, again, a personal choice. And, obviously if you have a latex allergy or something like that, that's not necessarily going to work. The theme here really, as we go through all these methods, is that there is no one method for everybody or every couple. And it's really up to you to decide what's going to work best for you and your partner. Okay, so let's move on to the diaphragm or cervical cap. So there was a time when diaphragms were much more common, when it was very commonplace for women to go to their doctors and be custom fitted with diaphragms, and doctors were well trained in that skill of fitting. And this, it was a lot easier. So these days it's a lot harder to get, say, a custom fitted. Many doctors don't even have that skill anymore. But fortunately, there are diaphragms that are available without having to be custom fitted, like the Kaya diaphragm. And it's not necessarily an advertisement, but just to say that there are certain brands of diaphragm that you can buy. And similar with the cervical cap. So there's different brands like the Fem Cap. And again, this isn't an advertisement or necessarily endorsement, but just to get you started if this is something that interests you. So with the diaphragm and the cervical cap, the diaphragm is designed to go into the vagina so that the device can completely cover the cervix, and it actually fits behind the pubic bone. And the cervical cap is often fitted on the end of the cervix, so actually fitting over the cervix itself. And diaphragms and cervical caps are intended to be used with spermicide. So when you're using the diaphragm, if we're talking about perfect use, they are intended to be used with spermicide, which we'll talk about in a moment. So the efficacy, we're going through perfect use efficacy is around 92%, and then typical use fluctuates between, anywhere from 88% to 75%. And so as I mentioned, these devices are meant to be used with spermicide. So the diaphragm and the cervical cap, it's intended to actually put the spermicide inside, and then you would insert the diaphragm or cervical cap into your vagina and put it in place. So when you're using a diaphragm or cervical cap and you're using spermicide, you do want to make a point of looking for non-toxic spermicide. So there's a common basically toxin called nonoxynol 9 that can be very damaging and can cause all kinds of problems, not least of which irritation and, susceptibility to other variety of issues. So when you're looking for spermicide, you do want to look for a non-toxic, non-irritating, vagina-friendly, but yet still effective spermicide that you can use with these products. So in terms of perfect use with a diaphragm or cervical cap, you have to insert your diaphragm or cervical cap before you have sex. So you certainly want to make sure that it's inserted and inserted correctly before sexual contact. And then once you've had sex, you would make sure to actually leave the diaphragm or cervical cap in for a minimum of 6 to 8 hours afterwards. And so that ensures that everything is gone and dead before you remove it, to, reduce the chance of any sperm kind of making its way through. So the pros of the diaphragm or cervical cap, again, non-hormonal, that's the theme here. So all of these methods that I'm talking about are not disrupting your natural hormones. These methods don't require your partner's participation, so that's a pro for them because you can insert your cervical cap or diaphragm. You can do that well before, and so it doesn't require any cooperation on your partner's part. And of course, it can be used in conjunction with fertility awareness, and I'm going to go through them all first and then talk about how they can be used together. So the cons, obviously the effectiveness rate isn't as high. We're not looking at like a 99% effectiveness rate. But with that said, the effectiveness rate is still up there with perfect use. Of course, another con, depending on the situation, the person, you must insert it prior to sex. So again, it could be disruptive to the flow, depending on if it's spontaneous, it can kind of detract from that to some degree. You must use it with spermicide in order to have that ideal efficacy, and you do have to leave it then inserted after sex for that minimum of 6 to 8 hours. If you want to have sex multiple times, then you would have to reapply the spermicide, because if not, it may not be as effective. So without removing it, you would have to put more spermicide in. So that's the overview then of the diaphragm / cervical cap. And now we're just going to talk about withdrawal for a minute. So withdrawal, I call withdrawal, the dirty little secret. So on my end, I spend my days talking to women about their sex lives, about their cervical fluid. So I have all of these conversations about very intimate aspects of people's lives that most of you don't. Most of you don't have the same experience as I do. And so what I can tell you is a lot of people use withdrawal. So I'm not promoting it. I'm not saying yay or nay or anything. I'm just being objective, and I'm just sharing information. So just to be clear, I'm not saying do it or don't do it or whatever. I'm literally just saying that a lot more people use withdrawal than you probably think. And whenever someone mentions to me that they use withdrawal, it's like they look down and they're like, I use withdrawal, and like kind of apologize and all of that, because we were taught that it's not a method. I can remember that, being taught that withdrawal is not a method of birth control. It's basically just like, they call it the pull and pray, right? Because it's like, who knows if it's going to work? But it turns out that it is a method and it has an efficacy rate. So, with withdrawal, the perfect use efficacy rate is 96%, right? That's like high. You wouldn't think that for a non-method. And typical use would be closer to about 85%. So what that means is that there's a lot of couples who then use it and they start to wonder if they're just infertile because they, don't get pregnant. So to be clear, it doesn't necessarily work for everybody. And the big question with withdrawal is whether or not men contain sperm in their pre-ejaculatory fluid, because that would really be the downfall of withdrawal. So in terms of that question, when you look at the research, and so I cover all of this in a lot more detail in the Fifth Vital Sign, in case you're wondering, and if you're wanting like the stats and like the studies and all that stuff. But in terms of the question of whether or not men have sperm in their pre-ejaculatory fluid, when you look at the research is inconclusive. And one of the reasons why the research is inconclusive is because the studies that are available are often using quite small sample sizes. And I mean, why would that be? Why would a free method that's available to everybody that there's no way to monetize, why wouldn't giant companies want to study this? So I think it's a challenge. Really, it would be wonderful to have a lot more research done on withdrawal so that couples could really have that information and have this a much better understanding of whether or not it would work for them. But the research that we do have would indicate, so first of all, from a biological standpoint, men aren't supposed to have sperm in their pre-ejaculatory fluid because the pre-ejaculatory fluid is actually released from the Cowper's gland, so it's not actually the same place as where the semen comes from. So theoretically, there shouldn't be any sperm in the pre-ejaculatory fluid. But when we look at the studies, there are some studies that show that none of the men who are tested have any sperm in their pre-ejaculatory fluid. And there are other studies that show that some men have sperm in their pre-ejaculatory fluid, but other men do not. And the men who do not, they just don't. And the men who do. So that literally means that it's inconclusive. So with that said, I mean, withdrawal then does work for many couples. But then, of course, there's a possibility that it's just not going to work for some couples. And you wouldn't necessarily know that unless you had the means to test your partner's pre-ejaculatory fluid or you gave it the good old pull and pray try. Okay. So with that said, perfect use. So this is something that, again, if you don't even think it's a method, first of all, then our culture isn't necessarily going to talk about it and tell you how to use it correctly, right? Because it's not even like, we're not even thinking that it's a method. So why would you be talking about using it correctly? So many people are embarrassed even to say that they use it. So let's talk about it. So if you want to know, how to use withdrawal perfectly, like air quotes, perfect use withdrawal. So the important thing is that before you have sex, just in case he may have ejaculated earlier in the day or something like that, his semen and his urine pass through the same urethra. So it's like a corridor or something. And so before you have sex, just have him go pee. So have him urinate before sex. And then if there happened to be any sperm from a previous ejaculation just hanging out, then he's clearing that. And so then you have sex. And of course, he would have to withdraw before ejaculation. So however long before that is, and he would have to ejaculate away from your vulva, away from your cervical fluid, make sure those things are not joining, no contact there. And so then if you decide to have sex a subsequent time, then you would want to make sure that he does urinate in between, wash his hands, wash his penis type of thing, to make sure that any sperm that were in the urethra are cleared, flushed. So that's essentially perfect use. So what are the pros about withdrawal? So again, the same theme, non-hormonal, free, and available to everybody. It does involve your partner, which can be a positive or a negative depending. Of course, it can be used in conjunction with other methods, which we'll get to in a moment. And it does allow you to have sex without, the barrier in between you. So for many couples, that might offer an option where they're actually, couples who potentially don't love condoms, it allows this option to not have a barrier between you. So the cons, we talked about the research being inconclusive. So we don't have like a definitive 10,000 men study. If anyone wants to do it, I'd love to see the results so that we can get a more definitive answer on this question of, do men have sperm in the pre-ejaculatory fluid? So that's one of the cons, of course. It does require your partner's participation. So again, that can be a pro and a con depending on your relationship, but your partner has to know his body. He has to be able to withdraw, on time and all that. And it really does put the ball in his court, so there's got to be some trust there and he's got to be up to that. And so of course the big con with withdrawal is that if it fails, if he doesn't withdraw, you literally have no method. So that's something to consider as well. So like any of the methods, all of the methods that we've talked about, it's going to work for some couples and not for others. And it's really up to you to decide what level of, risk you're comfortable with and all of those things. So now that we've gone through basically the main non-hormonal options and we've gone through how to use them correctly, we've gone through the efficacy of all of them, we've gone through the pros and cons, and of course I'm sure there's other pros and cons that I didn't mention, but at least these are kind of giving you an idea and having you think about what would make more sense for you in these types of situations. Now we can talk about combining methods. And so especially when I have clients who are learning fertility awareness and they're still in those beginning stages. And of course, women who are learning on their own during that first 3 to 6 months before they are, really there with their learning and practice to feel confident using the fertility awareness method. Having an option like condoms or withdrawal or the Diaphragm cervical cap is certainly really helpful and important so that you can really take that time to learn how to chart your cycles. But of course, you are relying on the efficacy during your fertile window of the method that you choose. So I will always say that because if you have sex using a condom and the condoms are 98% effective, you are relying on the efficacy of the condom if you have sex during your fertile window. Now, one of the great things is with non-hormonal methods is that you can combine, say, a condom with a diaphragm and or cervical cap. So one of my issues that I mentioned already with non-hormonal methods is that they're often really heavily discouraged because some of the methods don't have a 99.99% efficacy rate or a typical use rate. However, if you were to use a diaphragm or cervical cap correctly with the spermicide and you were to also use a condom, you are now using 2 methods of birth control. And you can feel a lot more confident in the combined efficacy of those 2 methods versus, if you do have some concerns about the one method. And similarly with withdrawal, if you combine withdrawal with a diaphragm or cervical cap, then you have an additional measure. You're using 2 methods of birth control during that time. And so for many women, that is how they manage. For many women who are really on top of their charting, who are really I talk about the intention scale. So 10 being you want babies, you're already trying for babies and you may already be pregnant. And 0 being really, it's just not the time. And you and your partner are absolutely not trying and you are not ready for a baby. And so you're really open to no risk at all. And so I think the good news and the hope part of this episode, the whole episode is good news, but it's really that it is possible to be responsible and to be very effective and intentional with your use of non-hormonal methods, and it is entirely possible for you to successfully prevent pregnancy without hormones. And it's not like you just have like one kind of crappy option. You have multiple options that are effective on their own to, the degrees that we talked about, that can also be combined with other methods to improve overall efficacy. And so if you really don't want to be on hormones, the message is that you don't have to be afraid. The opposite of fear is probably not education. I think it's love. But education is the bridge, between being really afraid of unplanned pregnancies and feeling really out of control, like you're just at the mercy of whatever could happen, to really taking back the control and feeling like you have a plan and a strategy that you can follow. And especially when you bring these types of topics to your partner, I'm sure some of you might play this episode for your partner so that you can kind of then start that conversation on the same page. When you're able to do that, then it just changes everything, because when you have this knowledge, you can really empower yourself so that it doesn't feel like it's like hormonal contraceptives or nothing, right? Hormonal contraceptives or pregnancy, like that's such a lie. Obviously, not impressed by that. I don't know, this turn that our society has taken to convince women that it's really hormonal contraceptive or nothing. And again, it's not because there's one method that I think is right for everybody, but I think even after breaking down the different birth control methods, I'm sure some of you are like, oh my gosh, I wish I would have known this. Like, this makes sense to me. And even though I'm really, on the zero end of the intention scale, I feel like there's some combination in here that would actually work for me. And I didn't even know that. I didn't think about it that way. So I'm sure some of you are thinking some of those things. One other thing I'll mention is that it's not uncommon for couples to use condoms and withdrawal together, meaning that you have sex with the condom on, and then when it's time for him to ejaculate, he pulls out with the condom on. And so again, it's like combining two methods of birth control. And now for some of you who are listening, you might think, oh my gosh, that's kind of overkill. But remember, we have people of all different ages, of all different relationships, of all different comfort levels, of all different life situations. And so this offers the levels of protection and everything, like everywhere in between. So I have plenty of clients who are really comfortable using withdrawal, and they'll use withdrawal by itself in their fertile window. I have plenty of clients who are not comfortable with that, and they will use condoms and withdrawal. And I have clients who will use a diaphragm with withdrawal, or a cervical cap with condoms, or just condoms, or just a diaphragm, or, the options are endless, but this allows you the opportunity to combine fertility awareness charting. So first of all, when you understand your cycle and you know how to identify your fertile window, then it allows you, if you are more on that zero end of the intention scale, to really combine, double up your methods during that time, learn about perfect use, and use your methods perfectly during that time. And I also have clients that will identify their fertile window. And so maybe they will then use condoms throughout their cycle, or use withdrawal, throughout their cycle, and then use condoms in the fertile window or something like that. And if you chart your cycles and you identify your fertile window, let's say after ovulation, you've confirmed ovulation, you know the rules, you can't get pregnant after you've confirmed ovulation when you follow the rules. It's biologically impossible, but we don't have enough time to go into that today. There's plenty of episodes where we talk about that a little bit more depth. But let's just say, for example, that you're in the post-ovulatory phase. So if you also use a condom, or if you also use withdrawal during the time of your cycle where pregnancy is not possible, you are using two methods of birth control. You are actually doubling up, right? So this just gives you lots of different options for how to manage it. And especially for those of you who are super terrified of coming off of contraceptives, or you've kind of been easing your way into fertility awareness, I feel like this conversation just opens up some possibilities, and it really makes it so that it's more approachable conversations you can have with your partner. And also, hopefully, my biggest goal, or hope, I guess I should say, not goal, but my biggest hope for you is that it's less scary, and that we can move away from being so afraid of, feeling really out of control and feeling like your fertility is something really scary that is just going to betray you, to feeling more in control and feeling more comfortable with your choices. So that brings us to the end of today's episode. That's really, it's like I had to get it off my chest, but I really wanted to go through that. That was a topic that I have been getting a lot more questions about recently. And it's something that, I haven't done this particular episode on the podcast. So I'm glad that that all of you who did reach out and asked for this episode, I'm glad that you did. I think I had someone reach out recently actually too. And that was like, adding to the list of people who asked for this episode. So it was a good reminder, and it's so important. And as you can tell, for me, it's really about reducing the fear around not being on hormones and being at least one person in the world or in your life maybe who has basically told you that no, it is actually possible to avoid pregnancy successfully and effectively without hormones, if that's what you want. If that's really what you want and you're willing to take the time to learn and understand and to, learn about fertility awareness, learn about the other non-hormonal methods, learn about how they can work together, use them correctly every time, involve your partner, have these adult conversations, right? And then if you're willing to do the work, then it's completely possible. All of my clients have really complicated jobs and really busy, complex lives. And so it's just insulting to think that we couldn't figure this out if we really want to figure it out. So that's like my cheer for you today. You can do this if you want to. Just make sure to take the time that you need to learn. And of course, take the time to get the support that you need if you do need that extra support. So if you're learning fertility awareness, of course, I would encourage you to seek support from an instructor. Of course, I have programs, but there's plenty of instructors who teach. And this is how you can get to that place that you feel really confident so that you can really just leave that fear behind and start enjoying these wonderful intimate moments with your partner. So with that said, thank you so much for tuning in. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode over at fertilityfriday.com/330. That is a lot of podcast episodes. That means this is episode number 330. It's actually kind of wild. It's incredible what can happen just doing one episode a week for almost 6 years. But that is where we're at. I know that this episode, since I was getting a lot of requests for it, I know that people want to hear it. So if you know someone who could really benefit from today's episode, please do share it because obviously there's not a lot of places that people are talking about all these things in this way. And so, please do share it far and wide because, like I said, I know people are asking for it. That's why I listened and I shared it. So, and then tag me if you share out on social. Make sure to tag me and let me know. And so, with that said, have a wonderful weekend, whenever you're tuning in to today's show. And of course, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.